Good morning, everybody. I'm Karen Friedman Quinn, adult programming associate here at the library. On behalf of our director, Caroline Mandler, and the rest of the staff, I'd like to welcome you here this morning for what will prove to be a very interesting talk. I am just going to quickly introduce Eve Kessler, who is with SPED NET, and she will introduce today's speaker to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So this is our last presentation of the year. We are really happy to have Robert Tudisco here. For those of you who aren't familiar with our website, we have videotapes of all of our speakers, including Robert, on our website. They are categorized by topic and by speaker, and they're really fantastic. You can get an incredible amount of information that way. Robert Tudisco is a nationally recognized author, motivational speaker, and nonprofit management consultant. He is also an adult diagnosed with ADHD. As Senior Counsel to Barger Gaines, he specializes in matters involving school disciplinary hearings, criminal defense, and special education advocacy. We are really happy to have you here. Oh, do you want to do questions?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming out to talk about the white elephant in the room, really, and that is stigma. And I think that what we want to talk about today is how it impacts how you as parents, teachers, grandparents, aunts and uncles address that stigma, but how you can proactively protect your children and really build towards a better future. So with that, I'm going to get started. In terms of questions, just a couple of things. I always try to be careful with legal questions. I do represent children with disabilities, parents trying to get services for their kids. I just caution you, if it's a fact-specific question about your particular situation, in terms of your own privacy, you should probably maybe talk to me afterwards, or you could always email me. I'll provide my contact information. If you have questions about the slides that arise, let me know. If it's starting to back up, maybe we'll just kind of like put some of the questions towards the end. And also remember, when we do questions, we're going to have a mic that we're going to circulate, because this is being recorded, and your questions want to come up on the video, because other people may have similar ones. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, where does stigma come from? We're going to talk today about understanding where it comes from. In terms of addressing it, really understanding some of the disabilities themselves. And I think that a lot of times people will be afraid of a diagnosis, a label, if you will, and without really understanding the disability itself. And I think that knowledge is going to be really significant, especially since the best way really to deal with stigma is to educate people, educate your children. This may go without saying, but when it comes to children with disabilities, you really have to let them educate you in terms of how their disability is causing what you're seeing from the outside, understanding frustration from their perspective. That is something that is often overlooked by parents who are trying to protect their children from social stigmas and so on. So we're going to be talking about ADHD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and learning disabilities as three. I'm going to be mentioning some other co-occurring conditions. Understanding the impact of stigma now and moving forward into the future, strategies to address stigma, and we're going to talk about that two ways: stigma out in the community, but also to protect your child from stigma, and really to get to open the discussion with them, how to talk with them about their disability, how to get information, and the importance of that. We're going to talk about some practical do's and don'ts, and then try to wrap it up. Okay, so now, where does stigma arise? Out of fear. People are afraid of something that they don't understand. And one of the things that I said a moment ago is that opening a window into these disabilities from someone's perspective that is dealing with it is really going to be very helpful in addressing that figure, taking that fear factor, because it takes away some of the unknown. Lack of accurate information. We're going to try to develop as much accurate information today. And your homework is going to be, if you are dealing with a child, an adult, a young adult with a disability, understanding and learning from them the impact of the disability on them, what frustrates them, what shuts them down, what are some of the reasons for some of the behaviors that you might be seeing, or some of the issues that arise in school, whether it be elementary school, middle school, even post-secondary education. Traditional biases that go along with the quote unquote invisible disabilities, things that, there are people who are sight impaired, there are people who have physical medical disabilities that prevent them from accessing certain things. But in some cases, you can see a disability, and in other cases, you really can't. So it takes an added level of understanding. And hopefully we can kind of work into that today. Another basis is that parents, and we're going to see how counterintuitive this is going to be. One of the reasons for stigma is because parents want to protect their children with disabilities, and we will find out that that protection sometimes, with the best of intentions, can really perpetuate those stigmas. So we want to be careful about that. Wanting to protect ourselves. There are a number of myths and misconceptions about a lot of these disabilities that hopefully we can dispel today. And let's talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about ADHD. Okay, it's a willpower issue. Just try harder. Every parent of a student with ADHD, even those who aggressively advocate for them, will typically say, there are those moments, and trust me, my wife is filled with these moments. Why can't you just do what you're supposed to do? Okay, and it's not that easy. There are a number of reasons you see from the outside what you're seeing, what that child's teachers are seeing, and how it's caused by that. It is a lot more complicated, okay? One of the things about ADHD that people used to say was that it is something that has to do with hyperactive boys, okay? When I was diagnosed as an adult, I am probably a combined type, but there's a certain amount of hyperactivity that declines after puberty. And so that's not always an issue, and that there is an inattentive type, which I'm going to qualify because in my very unclinical opinion, I don't believe that there's such a thing as inattentive ADHD. I think the hyperactivity just looks a little different, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So that was what we used to find, that it was typically the children that were bouncing off of the walls, sometimes girls, but almost always it was the boys that we would see a lot of these types of behaviors, and it was picked up, and that's what kind of was associated with ADHD. When I was an adult and I got diagnosed and would talk about it with people, or even people that I went to school with many years before, they would say, but you weren't hyperactive. And that's really kind of a red herring in a way. Okay. It's an excuse for lazy kids or bad kids. I say a lot that when I was young, back in the 70s, going to Catholic school, they didn't call it ADD, they called it BAD. We were just bad kids. That's what anybody knew, that's what anybody thought of, that was what they were seeing. I don't know that I was necessarily a bad kid, but I have to say that I was spectacularly obnoxious as a child in the classroom, to the extent of disrupting things or trying to kind of take over the classroom and so on. We hear a lot that it's an excuse for bad parenting. They're not parenting their children appropriately, and that's, they made up this word ADHD to kind of, as a way to kind of cover up for bad parenting. It's something they grow out of, okay? That's something that you hear a lot, and I'll talk about where that comes from. We're overdiagnosing these kids, and we're over-medicating them. I will say that I've been taking medication for almost 25 years. It's made a huge difference in my life, but it is not the end all be all. It is a part of a multifaceted process, and it can be a very useful tool. There are some people it doesn't work for. In many cases, there are co-occurring disabilities that traditional ADHD medication won't address, or something else has to be addressed as a primary disability or co-occurring condition. So it does get somewhat complicated. And this is the one that gets me angry, okay? I've been interviewed on television, I've been interviewed on podcasts, and people say that to me all the time. Aren't we all a little ADHD? We're not. I can definitively tell you that we're not, and I'll explain a little bit more afterwards. Let's talk about what ADHD is, and then I'll get into the realities of those myths and misconceptions. All right, ADHD is a neurobiological condition that affects the prefrontal cortex of the brain, okay? It is the portion of your brain, and I'm going to give you a qualifier. As an attorney, I can tell you whenever you stray outside of your field, we're trained to give a good disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. This is my understanding. I'm sure I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but essentially it affects the portion of your brain that regulates executive functioning, okay? Now, it also affects and impacts the neurotransmitter portion of your brain, or your central nervous system, I should say, and how information gets to your brain and how it's processed. Okay, the three main neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine is the third, which is essentially adrenaline. So you see a lot of these kids that are the adrenaline junkies, kind of living on the edge, okay? And I'm going to show you how that really is in many ways a coping mechanism for something that is neurologically not working in the body, okay? Now, what are executive functions? A lot of people think about them as the office manager or the conductor of the symphony in your head. Okay, it's the part of your head that kind of regulates and controls everything in terms of organization. Prioritization is a huge one. Time perception. Okay, people will often say that someone with ADHD are poor time managers. Okay. That is a gross understatement. If you have an executive functioning disability, okay, you can't manage anything effectively. Time is more of a complicated issue because it's not just managing time, it's perceiving time in an accurate way. If your thoughts, and before I said about, I don't think there's any such thing as inattentive, non hyperactive ADHD, because even inattentive people, the kid in the back seat of the classroom staring out the window, not getting his work done, um, they are not causing a behavioral problem. But what you can't see is the cognitive hyperactivity, the amount of information that's constantly swirling around at the speed of light inside of our heads. And that really presents a problem because if all of these thoughts are swirling around at light speed with no organization in your head, there's a huge disconnect from the reality of life, the slow reality of life. Okay. And so there's a huge disconnection. It's more about not accurately being able to understand how long a task is going to take, always thinking you have more time than you actually have to do it. And that constant inability to accurately estimate is really part of the issue. And then you throw the management problem in there and it becomes huge, hugely problematic. Okay, impulse control. I do a lot of suspension and discipline work in my practice. And I can tell you that for kids with ADHD, impulse control is really the behavioral culprit. These kids know the difference between right and wrong. It's not about knowing right from wrong. It's an inability to control or curb an impulse to do what seems like a good idea at the time, even if you know you're not supposed to do it. That is really where a lot of these kids fall into those problems. Okay. Um, Hyperactivity in some ways. I mentioned before about boys, typically that will decrease after puberty. And sometimes as boys, and especially with ADHD girls, there's a lot of research now about how much more often women's bodies change and how much more radically they change as they go through life. And so their response to medication changes. And so a lot of times they will have to be reevaluated. A medication that was effective at some point in time is less effective now, or it has to be, the dosage has to be changed or something like that. All right. Attention regulation. That's really important to understand. It's not about not being able to pay attention. That's where many of us get caught up, is not paying attention. But it's more about the regulation of it. All right. Just think about it for a second. I get parents coming into my practice all the time saying, the teacher says he can't pay attention, but he could play video games for 10 hours. Okay. It's not about not being able to pay attention. It is a question of extremes. Okay. There is either no attention or extreme hyperfocus. There's no medium or baseline that most people without this condition experience. And so that is, the source of a lot of frustration for teachers, for parents. He won't shut the game off. He won't shut his music off. When I tell him he's got to do his homework, or he's got to, come and have dinner or do his chores. And that presents some significant problems. You have to understand, it doesn't make you being ignored right. But what you have to understand is hyperfocus. For someone who is challenged, I run into this with my wife all of the time. I get a burst of energy at 5:30. And so I just start diving into my work, and she'll call me at 8 and say, aren't you coming home for dinner? And I will tell her, I know it's frustrating, but when I find that wave of hyperfocus, I really try to ride it as best as I can. And that's important to know and understand. I certainly have a responsibility to let her know that's happening, but I think that that is something that people need to know from the outside, that is why this is going on. Short-term memory problem. Okay, short-term memory. If you think of a computer, okay, a computer has two types of memory. One is the box that sits next to your monitor, that how much material or information that computer can hold. Okay, that's like your long-term memory. And people with ADHD typically have frighteningly accurate long-term memory. The other type of memory in your computer is the RAM, random access memory. Okay, and that is the amount of short-term memory so that your computer, how many programs can be operating simultaneously. Okay, that is where we have a problem. Okay, the inability to manage those programs or our short-term memory is really what you put your keys down on the table and you're focused on something. That act of putting those keys down didn't happen because you're already way past it. It's funny. Before my diagnosis, I'll tell you a funny story. I dated this girl in college, and it got so bad that when I would come to her apartment to pick her up, she would like block the door with a basket in her hand, and she would say, "Keys, wallet, and glasses. Give them to me now, or you can't come in, because I'm not going to spend a half an hour looking for them. We're going to miss the movie." And it really was a short-term memory issue. All right. Before I said, the whole myth about we're not all a little ADHD, this, I think, goes towards helping that situation. We hear a lot these days about executive functioning impairment. Okay. What does that mean? How does it relate to ADHD? I built this slide because I think it's important for people to understand that you can have an executive functioning impairment, okay? It could be manageable, it could be mild. You could have an executive functioning impairment that is more severe, and you can have an executive functioning impairment that is so severe it rises to the level of diagnosable ADHD. Conversely, if you flip it around, you can have impairments with executive function. That doesn't mean you have ADHD. If you have ADHD, you definitely have an executive functioning impairment. Okay, so if you think of it that way, I think it makes a little bit more sense. Okay, and really what we're talking about here is the extent and pervasiveness of the impairment and the chronic nature of it. Anybody can lose their keys. Okay, that doesn't mean you have ADHD. And it's important because it really is frustrating to someone with ADHD when you hear things like that sometimes. When I'm asked this question, it's always, don't we all, and aren't our attention spans all getting shorter with the 30-second news bite or the Twitter tweet or whatever? And as a society, I think that's accurate to say all of our attention spans are getting shorter. But imagine if you have a neurological impairment that really significantly impacts the way you process information. It can make it so much worse. All right, so let's talk about this. When we were all young and in school, we learned that you put your hand on a hot stove and a message goes up your arm to your brain and says, "It's hot, move your hand." Okay, so we naturally think about it in terms of like plugging in an electric light. You plug the cord into the wall socket, the electricity goes up to the light, and the light goes on. But that's not how it works in the human body. Okay, the central nervous system is not a continuous wire like that. It is a series of disconnected wires, and those disconnections are managed by these neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Okay, and you have to have enough of the neurotransmitter and appropriate receptors on the other end so that you can bridge that gap so that the information or data can kind of flow through to your brain. If there is a blockage in that system anywhere, it's going to cause a problem. And you will see many of these kids, norepinephrine, like adrenaline, they will put themselves in high risk, high stim situations as a means of coping with that problem, flooding themselves with dopamine, the pleasure center of your brain, and the neurotransmitter that gets to it, or the adrenaline that you produce, flooding yourself with it to cope for a broken system. Okay? Now, cognitive hyperactivity. I try to explain to my wife how I kind of picture thoughts in my head. Sometimes it frightens her. I kind of think of them in a bunch of different ways. In terms of cognitive hyperactivity, I think of those like swirling school of fish that are constantly going on. And one of the reasons a lot of my thoughts as I speak seem to be disjointed and disconnected is because something will trigger one of those fish to pop out and give me a thought. And sometimes you get a lot of kids like me calling out in class because they're afraid that that fish is going to get back into the system before they get it out there. How do you capture that thought before it goes to the other side of the Grand Canyon in your brain? That is particularly a problem. It doesn't make it right that they're talking out of turn, but understanding why it happens can lead to addressing it more appropriately. All right. This is another visual that I like to talk about, and that is if you picture a place like New York City, okay, that's the center of culture and commerce and everything else that you could imagine. People are flying in from all over the world to get to this metropolis. But instead of a bunch of international airports, there's only one poorly run landing strip, okay? What do they do at the airport when there's too many planes coming in and they don't have a place to land? They stack them up in these holding patterns, kind of whirling around and whirling around. But just imagine for a second, if one of those planes had an emergency, a mechanical failure, a fire, a bomb, a medical issue, instant clearance to land because it's an emergency. And people with ADHD go through our lives seeking out and gravitating towards high risk, high stim situations. Okay, we go through our lives looking to put out fires, and sometimes we even cause these chaotic situations because it's a means of forced prioritization. That plane with the emergency got immediate clearance to land. That is why many times the book report that they get 6 months to do, 6 weeks to do, is always done the last night at 12:30 with a flashlight under the covers, okay, because it's do or die now. My back's against the wall, the adrenaline of it, okay? Just so you kind of understand what's going on here, all right? Let's talk about some of the realities to break those myths and misconceptions. Okay, it's not a willpower issue or an excuse for lazy or bad students. It's a neurobiological condition that affects your brain, and this is really important. ADHD, learning disabilities, autism. Autism is a little bit more complicated, but these disabilities are not intelligence deficits. They are performance deficits. And that is really important for you to understand because people that say, even parents who want to protect their children, I had a psychologist call me once to say, you know, I believe my son has ADHD. He got into trouble at school. I asked if there was a 504 plan or an IEP, and she said, no, I never had him formally evaluated by the school because I didn't want to pathologize my client, my son, which was the way she put it. A lot of parents will use the word label. I don't want to label him, okay? And really what that comes from are people making an irrational jump between a disability and intelligence. Okay, and that's one of the bases. And what's also important for you to understand is if you are afraid that people are going to think your child is not intelligent because they have a disability, and you kind of block and protect your child from that. Secrecy breeds shame, okay? And what you can't see is how this disability permeates a child's sense of self-esteem, okay? And it will also lead to a number of problems that they're going to face in life later on. Okay, so it really is something important that we're going to have to discuss how to address it appropriately outside of the home and how to address it appropriately inside of the home. Okay, I can tell you that a kid with LD, a kid with autism who actually can functionally communicate with you, a kid with ADHD, all feel the same way, that so much of their lives are outside of their control. And developing that conversation with them, okay, is really incredibly empowering for a child. Okay. And it helps you as a parent when you go to school to request services or support, because speaking to your child, they should know that they are not only participating, but they should be driving that process. It's about them. What makes you angry about school? What frustrates you about school? I can tell you, as a kid growing up with undiagnosed ADHD, there was an enormous sense of frustration. I always felt that there was more going on behind my eyes than I was able to get credit for. And it was enormously frustrating to me. I just didn't know there was a name for it at that time. All right. Let's see. It's not an excuse, but again, it helps us understand motivation and where behaviors can come from. Okay. It's not an excuse for bad parenting. However, how you parent your child with ADHD or LD or autism spectrum disorder does matter significantly. Okay. It's something they grow out of. They don't grow out of it. Statistically, 70% of people have ADHD as a lifespan disorder. If you have dyslexia, dysgraphia, it doesn't go away. I think it's actually higher than that as a lifespan disorder. It may be, though, when you get to a certain age in your career or when you retire, it doesn't matter as much. But there are significant impairments as you go through different stages of your life. I often say that I don't suffer from ADHD. I have ADHD. My wife suffers from ADHD because she married me. She's along for the ride. Unfortunately, it's a part of dealing with it. Okay. What we do see, though, is certain symptoms of ADHD do decrease, like the hyperactivity after puberty. So you may see that. Okay. It's not just hyperactive boys. It involves girls as well. There are some hyperactive girls. By and large, I've seen more inattentive, and by that I mean that cognitive hyperactivity I was talking about earlier. And okay, aren't we all a little ADHD? And I was saying before, it's about the chronic nature and the level of impairment that really needs to be understood here. And the only way I can really explain this is there is a significant difference between someone who has an imbalance in their brain chemistry leading to clinical depression, people that get hospitalized for, people that have to take medication, people with bipolar disorder, versus sadness that we all experience from time to time in our lives. It's not the same thing. It's the level of the impairment and the chronic nature of it that really make the difference. Okay. And I'm going to talk a little bit towards the end about some practical things parents may say to their children, thinking they're kind of bonding with them over their disability. And sometimes it can make it worse. Innocent things that are said, to try and help. Okay. Now, a lot of this has to do with executive functioning and those administrative tasks. A lot of kids at different levels of their development, fourth grade is a big transition, Going to middle school is a big transition. High school, certainly. College is probably the biggest one. But a lot of these kids will say, it's not that the work is that much harder. There's so many more things I have to learn to remember this year. And that's where I keep tripping over myself. Okay, like for instance, they have to bring different books to different classrooms. They have to have a different binder for each classroom that they have to remember. I was the kid, the obnoxious kid who never, ever, ever had a pen. There's a pen that I like now as a coping mechanism. I will not leave my house unless I have two of them in my pocket. Okay. Over time, as they get older, their assignments become more long-term assignments, okay? They become timed through either a calendar or a clock, and that can add a lot of stress to their day. They have to keep track of their papers. I can't tell you how many of my clients do the homework, because I never did, ever, and don't turn it in. It's like in the bottom of a desk drawer somewhere. That is, an acute executive functioning issue. How much anxiety do you think can be over forgetting your lunch and everybody else has it and what to do? The lunch money, whatever administrative tasks there might be. I want to talk a little bit about learning disabilities, because they are a little bit more complicated because there's more of them, okay? And you have to understand that it does not mean that these children are not intelligent. It means that they process information differently than other children, okay? Learning disabilities are generally considered an umbrella term for a lot of neurological disorders that affect the ability to acquire information and process it effectively, okay? It can involve input in terms of reading and decoding the words, the letters themselves. They can be juxtaposed. It can just be difficult to get through them. There are two that come to mind. Dyslexia is one I'm sure you've all heard of. Phonemic awareness is another one that involves the inability to associate phonetic sounds with actual printed words. Okay. And what the significance about phonemic awareness is that when it comes to reading, a lot of kids will shut down because they can't make that association. And many times, phonemic awareness problem is misdiagnosed as ADHD because they just shut down and stop paying attention. But it is really important to get to the bottom of what's going on. Another thing that's really important when you talk about stigma, I'm going to mention this later, but when it comes to the support that your kids need, okay, special education there are these antiquated thoughts about, I'm not going to label my kid for special ed. That's where the special kids go. That's where the short school bus comes and they have this dingy classroom under the stairs. Special education is not a place. Special education is a service, and schools are under a legal requirement to provide that service in a least restrictive environment. And so what happens is many times kids will be brought to a reading specialist, let's say, if they're dyslexic. A lot of times they will have a reading specialist push into the classroom so they can still sit with their friends. They just need to catch up a little bit. They just need to be able to understand a little bit more in terms of decoding. Now, reading is one of them. When people think about learning disabilities, dyslexia is the one that always kind of pops out, but there are others. There are disorders that such as dyscalculia, where the ability to work with numbers in a functional way is impaired. Okay. It is, whether it's some kids, it's addition. And for some kids, it's the concept of association between two types of numbers, whether you're subtracting, whether you're adding. There are definitely supports that you can get for your child to overcome that. There are memory issues that go along with certain learning disabilities in terms of their short-term memory. Output is the other side of the coin. We were talking initially about input and processing and integration, but output, how do you speak? How do you write? How do you convey information? You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you can't convey that information actively, it's going to be a problem, especially at the student level. I'll tell you that it was not uncommon at all for the nuns to call my mother into school when I was young and to say, look, we can put this kid up in front of the class. He can speak, he can be funny, he can engage people, but we cannot get him to write. We can't read what he writes. He can't structure a sentence. That is a functional handicap he's going to carry through the rest of his life with, and you have to understand that. Okay, in college, before my diagnosis, I had to stop writing notes in notebooks because I couldn't read my own handwriting. It wasn't until I found a calculator as a means to input information and express myself. Now I write professionally for a number of disability magazines, okay? And it's funny, in terms of stigma and fear of protecting your children, my parents learned about ADHD after my diagnosis because I am like Mr. ADHD out there. And I'm very open about my disability because I really think that's the only way we're going to defeat stigma, is by whittling. There's nothing to be afraid of. I don't feel I need to apologize to anyone for having ADHD. Some of the things I do because of my ADHD require apologies from time to time. Okay. But that's a difference that you have to make. But I remember saying to my mother, who sat through all of those conversations when I was younger, when I would get an article published in a magazine, I would bring it to her and say, see, and she would say, you know, I am so proud of you. You're helping people. You got your article published in a magazine. I want to show people, but then they'll know about your thing, you know? And that's what we're really talking about here, okay? Mom, it's not a thing. I'm okay with it, you know? And having that open conversation is really key. Okay, sometimes it is the motor issue, handwriting, and kids with ADHD, there are a number of issues. A lot of them have sensory integration or fine motor skills issues. A lot of times I think that the school of fish that I showed you before, or the airplanes, there's too much coming out of their head that to write it in any kind of legible way, the way it's kind of flowing out. A lot of times, you know, I write left-handed. I have a mixed dominant issue that was undiagnosed. I didn't even know that that was a thing until I started learning and representing kids. And there are a number of ways that these can be addressed and coped with. And it's really important that you have these conversations and not be afraid to discuss it in school. Certainly to say, I want to, you know, make sure my son or daughter gets the best services that they need to address these issues. And if I don't have that conversation in school, you know, they may fall behind their friends or their peers. But it's also important to have that conversation with your son or daughter. When you look at the paper, what do you see? Does that make you angry? Is it a problem seeing the board? It may be an eye issue. Some kids, I have, for instance, a tracking problem with one of my eyes, that as I'm reading text along a page, to get to the next line, my eye drops like 3 or 4 lines. So I will often lose my place. Add that to the inability to attend and the boredom of seeing all those words on a page, it's a recipe for disaster. As parents, you need to know that. You need to let your kids know that it doesn't mean you're not as smart as the other kids. It means you need to do things differently, okay? And that really is the message here. It's not about better or worse. It's about different. And dealing with it in an appropriate way. Let's move into autism a little bit. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disability that affects the ability to process information and to socially communicate and to socially interact with people appropriately. There are people on the autism spectrum that have, significant cognitive developmental issues that are not verbal, but there are also a number of people who can speak and who can verbalize, but the ability to socially communicate appropriately is a problem. Okay. Also, one of the things I've noticed in my practice is I represent a lot of kids on the spectrum. When I started doing this work, it was because of all the things that I learned about ADHD from my own research. I started out as a criminal defense attorney. And after my own diagnosis and seeing patterns in my clients, I felt it would be really helpful to take that knowledge and try to help them in a constructive way. When you're a defense attorney, you get the call too late. Johnny brought a gun to school in high school. But if I was helping his parents get an appropriate behavioral intervention plan when he was in 3rd grade or 4th grade, maybe I wouldn't be getting that call or as many of them later on. Okay. And with kids on the spectrum, what I've learned is that especially kids who are nonverbal, but other kids that are somewhat verbal, have difficulty in communicating. And because they can't communicate, they use behaviors as a form of communication. The kid who's hitting himself, the kid who's throwing himself on the floor. Just think about being trapped in a body that doesn't respond the same way to what your urges are, your needs are. I'm hungry, I'm frustrated. A lot of programming now deals with teaching these kids sign language, teaching these kids to work with programming on a tablet that they can effectively communicate. Even when they're communicating anger and frustration, communicating it is better than acting out on it, okay? But there are also people who are verbal that are gifted. I do a program, even I was just talking about this before, with an attorney who has profound dyslexia and another who was on the autism spectrum. And we talk about our own disabilities and how that enables us to help our clients better and understand them better. And it's funny because I stole a lot of their slides for this presentation today, but it really is helpful to understand where the behaviors are coming from, especially when it comes to misbehaviors, okay, or periods of dysregulation is a clinical term that's used. Understanding where the behavior comes from is very different than saying, because my son has ADHD or he has autism, you can't punish him. There are specific sections of school discipline laws for children with disabilities that provide added layers of protection for them, okay? But that doesn't mean, and this is where you really need to break the mindset. My experience has been when I go into those suspension hearings, the word manifestation, that's what we have to determine in a lot of these hearings, whether or not the behavior was a manifestation of their disability. And if it is, then they have added protections. The word manifestation is like a dirty word to a school superintendent or a principal. It sticks in their throat because they feel you're giving this kid a free pass because they have a disability. And as a parent, you need to change that narrative. You need to say, my son or daughter's disability doesn't mean they get to act out and misbehave. Understanding their disability means we need to know where that behavior came from so we can do something so it doesn't happen again tomorrow. That is the narrative that you want. Because if you as a superintendent are worried about the safety of the rest of the kids, understanding where these behaviors come from and addressing them appropriately is going to keep everybody safe, including my child and the rest of the kids in your school. there are different levels of autism. There used to be classifications, Asperger's versus pervasive developmental disability, and others. They've kind of broken it down to three major categories. Level one, requiring some support, difficulty initiating social interactions. These kids are typically are verbal, but they have difficulty in understanding social situations. Okay. They will say the wrong thing. I've had a number of kids on the spectrum who play video games really well and don't understand the difference between the virtual world and the real world. So if you're playing Mortal Kombat, it's pretty common to beat someone into submission, or they have all of these graphics to zap them with lightning or do all of these things. I represented a kid once who thought it was perfectly fine to come into school and tell the kids how he was going to kill them and do things to their bodies like he saw in his video games. He did not know the difference between the two. And what we had were two parents from a culture where they felt it was their responsibility to protect him and pretend that he was, for lack of a better word, neurotypical. And so these behaviors perpetuated until he was, the first time I met him was in a secure facility, and he was 11 or 12 at the time. So how they interact is really key, and it's not just words. Sometimes it's the kids who kind of get excited and want to hug somebody or stand too close to somebody, not understanding and reading body language. If two people or three people are having a conversation, being able to read that social situation is just as important as reading words in a book as you go through life. And a lot of these kids are completely oblivious to it. And as a parent, understanding and recognizing that and having regular discussions with your child, that they should not be ashamed of who they are, even if they have difficulty in certain areas, and maybe how we can address that, how they interact with their siblings at home, requesting not only social skills training or counseling at school, but part of it be individual and part of it be in a group setting, so they get the opportunity to interact with their peers in an appropriate way while someone's kind of working with them and teaching them. And those skills constantly need to be reinforced. Okay. So having that open conversation, the worst thing you can do is say, people are going to think something bad about my child if they find out my child is disabled. So I'm going to ensure total secrecy and not even have that conversation. I can't tell you how many parents will say, he's taking medication, but I tell him it's vitamins. Or I chop it up and put it in his food so he doesn't know what it is. Okay. Kids are a lot more perceptive than you give them credit for sometimes. Okay. And it really is, it reinforces the fact that maybe I should be embarrassed of who I am. Okay. And that is a place you don't want to be. The purpose of this, and I see people taking screenshots of the slides today, and this might be important and that might be important. I think they're available. Okay. But certain things, and it's funny because when I was a kid, I rarely took notes in school. In law school, there were classes I didn't even have a notebook for. But seeing people actually, if I say something and they're writing it down, I'm like, wow. But the one thing that I think is really important is to talk to your children, empower them, have these conversations. Okay. It's important for their own sense of self-esteem. It's also more important for them legally as they get older and go on to post-secondary education, because the law changes and you need to know about that. Okay. So let's move on a little bit. Level 2, there are some interactions. These are probably partially verbal students. And then you have requiring more support, and then likely students who are completely self-directed and who are isolated, likely nonverbal, and need a significant amount of support. Okay, now where does this all become difficult? There's an old saying, I'm going to go back to ADHD for a minute. ADHD rarely walks alone. And what we find is that in 65 to 70% of cases, it's present with another disorder. And that complicates it exponentially because these behaviors that stem from one disorder versus another magnify each other when they're present together. It poses a problem for the evaluator or the clinician. What do I address first? And that varies depending on which two disabilities. For instance, on the autism spectrum, it is fairly common now, we believe, that because of the neurological impairments that are going on, it also presents with ADHD at the same time. In that situation, autism becomes the dominant disorder to address, and the ADHD a secondary. There are different forms of treatment. One of the co-occurring conditions with ADHD fairly often is bipolar disorder. And typically the first level of medications that are used for ADHD are stimulant medications. They work probably the best, and they are relatively short-lived in the system. But if a child is present with ADHD and bipolar disorder, the stimulants will make the bipolar disorder worse. And they will push them into a manic phase against their normal cycle. And so they will treat it differently with antidepressants, for instance. Another group are learning disabilities, because if you take all of those executive functioning issues that I talked about before, and often kids with ADHD have a lot of difficulty reading because they can't attune to what they're reading. Having a learning disability really magnifies that significantly. Kids with autism, you can see a magnification of the ADHD symptoms, but also a lot of the behavioral impulsive portions of ADHD will get magnified as well. Oppositional defiant disorder is particularly difficult. Oppositional defiant disorder, oftentimes present with ADHD, if it is not addressed, it can develop into a full-blown conduct disorder, which is essentially irreversible. And that is what our prisons are filled with. Okay. They can magnify the conditions of each other, what to treat first, making sure you identify all of these co-occurring conditions to be addressed or to provide services for is really important. Which diagnosis is dominant, and it can certainly impact behavior. Physical aggression, tantrum behaviors, but another one as kids get older is when you get kids that are prone to risk taking, okay, before I get here, I want to finish this. There was a 10-year study done at Harvard, and kids with ADHD have a 50% higher occurrence of substance use disorder as they get older. If that child's ADHD co-occurs with a conduct disorder, so oppositional defiant disorder, untreated, develops into a full conduct disorder, that increased 150% likelihood of developing a substance disorder triples. Okay, that is a frightening statistic, and it is what is fueling the school to prison pipeline. All right, anatomy of a SEPTA meeting, and I speak at special education PTA meetings all over the country, right? And typically, before they introduce Mr. Tudisco, they talk for about 15 minutes about the business of the SEPTA. And 90% of that 15 minutes are questions like, where do you lock up the IEPs so nobody knows my children have a disability? Or does my son's homeroom teacher have to know that he's got ADHD? Okay. Who has to know my son has an IEP? These are the kinds of questions I see all of the time. And what you're doing from an outward perspective is you're doing that for a noble reason. You want to protect your child from these stigmas, the white elephant in the room. But you are, even with the best intentions, perpetuating them. You are saying there is something to be secret about, and that is problematic. And how does it impact your child when you get home? Okay. Secrecy. I'm protecting my child from stigma. Special education is an ugly term. ADHD is an ugly label. It makes me look like a bad parent. I won't take my child to a psychiatrist because people will think he's crazy. This one got so bad that a lot of child psychiatrists call themselves developmental pediatricians because it sounds better. It sounds less ugly. And that is what we're talking about here. Okay. Impact of the stigma on a child. Secrecy breeds shame. All right. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I was a kid with ADHD growing up in the 70s, and I never, ever, ever did any kind of homework. Okay. Once I left the school building, I was done. And my father was educated as a teacher when he lived in Europe, and he taught math. And so my math grade on my report card really was the linchpin to my life. I would either get punished or praised depending on my math grade. And I was probably a C plus student in math. Okay. And it caused a lot of tension between the two of us. When I was in 7th grade, we took these general aptitude tests in verbal and math. And a couple of weeks later, my parents got called to school. The nuns wanted to talk to them. It wasn't a regular parent-teacher conference. It was a special meeting that the nuns really needed to see my parents. So usually when that happened, I did something that I got in trouble for. So my coping mechanism was I would go to sleep early. So when they came home, hopefully they wouldn't wake me up, and maybe the next day it would kind of, wear off a little bit. My father pulled me out of bed, sat me in a chair, and ripped into me. He gave me the biggest lecture because the nun told him that I tested in the gifted range in math. So he now had scientific proof that I was lazy. Okay? You can't tell me you don't understand the work. The nun told me you were a genius. It's because you don't do your homework. You're an underachiever. You're lazy. You're wasting your talent. These are the kinds of things that even parents with the best intentions, and I'm sure he thought he was motivating me in that speech, who, from my perspective, I'm getting in trouble for doing well on a test. But, even with the best intentions as a parent, as a teacher, you are tasked with giving negative feedback. And these kids hear it all day. They don't necessarily understand why they're doing what they're doing, because if you're not having that conversation with them, not only are you not able to get them appropriate services at school, but they don't understand what's going on, which really exacerbates their frustration. You want to make sure that they're not hiding behind their disability. They understand it so they can access what they need. And your role as a parent should be teaching them how to advocate for themselves. That is really important, because when they go to college, and it's kind of like we cut them loose in space into this environment with much less structure. The law requires for them to identify their disabilities, provide support, and advocate for themselves. And even if you are with them during that process, I promise you're not with them on campus every day. So going to the disability office becomes, why should I go in and talk about my disability when my mother told me I should never tell anybody about it? Or I always felt different when I was growing up because my parents made me feel like I was broken because of my disability. When I go off to college, I just want to fit in with everybody else. certainly not going to identify myself as a disabled student. So I'm not going to access services. I'm not going to do anything. And you really put your child in a very, very difficult position. There are a number of things you can do to address that, to have the conversation, to bring somebody else into the loop, to have that conversation with them. And it should all be about motivating them in a positive way. There are interventions for LD, for ADHD, for some kids on the autism spectrum that involve helping them recognize what their talents are and helping them gravitate towards those talents. And if there is tension between you and your child because they're a child, they're adolescent, and they're going to push back against their parents no matter what, there are people that will step into that role. So you can kind of step back a little bit as a pressure release valve. And it really is important. You want to send your child to post-secondary with confidence and certainly not shame in who they are. That's crucial. Okay. ADHD permeates their sense of self-esteem. They won't get the support they need unless you have an open conversation with school about where the behaviors come from. And you can't have that. I mean, look, I don't have a magic wand here. I can't tell you your child needs this particular type of reading program. A reading specialist may help us with that. But that assistance gets boosted on steroids when you have that conversation with your child. What are you seeing? You know, is it a timing issue that you're not able to decode the words fast enough, or you just can't do it and you shut down? Those are conversations that should not be in the context of, you know, just don't talk to your teacher, don't ask for help, don't say you have, you know, ADHD or learning disabilities. That is really counterproductive to everything we're talking about today. Special education, I said before, is a service. It's not a place. You're not relegating your child to, you know, this antiquated notion of a place. They'll never be willing or able. You know, when they go away to college, it's not just about are they willing to speak up for themselves. Do they know enough about their disability that they can articulate their needs? That's really important. Legal barriers from stigma. It can be a barrier to services and support at school, obviously, supports and accommodation. Just giving a student the option to have extra time on a test or a quiet location. You have no idea how much anxiety that can reduce for them. It prevents them from protections that they're entitled to under the law, either through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or Section 504. It is a barrier to legal protections for school discipline. That manifestation process is really important. One of the things that gets done is if you determine that the behavior was a manifestation of the disability, the IEP team or the 504 team has to sit and decide. Formally, they have to go through these steps. Was the IEP or 504 plan appropriate? If it was appropriate, was it being followed? And they have to conduct a functional behavioral assessment and put into place a behavioral intervention plan. What that does is what I said earlier, understanding where the behaviors come from so we can prevent them from happening again in the future. And that's really key because kids on the spectrum that have a meltdown, kids with ADHD who are spiraling out of control, once a child goes into, if you think about it like the tachometer in a car, goes into that red zone, you can't pull them out until it runs its course, okay? What a functional behavioral assessment will do is identify what those triggering behaviors are or triggering events are and helps them navigate to avoid that meltdown. And that's really the idea behind it. And that is where, as parents, you have to frame that conversation. We need to understand why he does this. What can we do to avert it? What are the signs? Yes. Eve, you want to grab a mic so she can?
I would imagine a child on a 504 plan that had a meltdown or was functioning to the extent that they needed a behavioral assessment plan would then probably also have to have an IEP evaluation and probably end up on an IEP, which has greater legal protection anyway. How would they remain on a 504 likely if they're to that degree?
I think you are right. I think that's a good point, is that a lot of kids that are on 504 plans, just to give you an idea, IDEA is an educational statute, okay, with a lot of requirements for the school. 504 is not an education law, it's an anti-discrimination statute that essentially says you can't discriminate against someone who has a disability. There is some overlap, and this is a gross oversimplification, but the difference between the two is that an IEP typically deals with services and support, and 504 typically deals with accommodations. Okay. And so what happens is if they're just getting accommodations, they probably do need more in that particular situation. That is an excellent bridge to getting that 504 converted. But there are also a lot of kids who have IEPs that still need, a functional behavioral assessment and a behavioral intervention plan because their disability manifests in so many ways behaviorally. Okay. And one other facet of this, we're talking a lot about educating the school about your child's disability and functionally educating your child about their disability, but also the people in your community. Parents are sometimes reluctant to go to family get-togethers if my child exhibits behaviors in a certain way. It shouldn't be an all-or-nothing taboo. You should use your knowledge from speaking to clinicians, your child, the school, how these and why these things are going on, and how they need to be respected for who they are, but they may process information differently. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Yeah, ma'am, you had a question?
Yes. So my daughter just underwent all of the testing. She has severe ADHD, but the school found that she has dyscalculia or a learning disability in math. So they have told us that you cannot have an IEP and a 504 at the same time. And because they're talking about a school setting, her learning disability has trumped the ADHD, and now she's not getting any services for the ADHD. Again, because they can't do both at the same time. And I don't really understand why and how do I help her from here?
Okay. Well, first of all,
it goes together.
If she has, they are correct in a way that usually you don't have both. An IEP, there's a section of an IEP that talks about accommodations. Okay. And the accommodations, sometimes there's a dispute over, do you classify her as learning disabled? Do you classify her? Students with ADHD are classified for special education under the other health impaired category. It really depends on what they are seeing as the dominant diagnosis that's really causing much of the impairment. But you should be very careful to make sure that everything is being addressed if she needs additional time. Normally, if a kid only needed extra time or a quiet place for their test, that would be fine for a 504 plan. If your daughter needs more, those accommodations she would get in her 504 plan should be built into her IEP. So she should have both, but it would be called an IEP, essentially, is what is going on there. But it's really important to make sure you understand and make sure that all of the issues she's experiencing are covered either by a service and/or an accommodation. And developing that and knowing what to ask for can certainly be the challenge. Before I go to the next slide, did anybody else have a quick question, or I'll move on to the next slide then. Okay. Let's see. Self-esteem. All right. This is a quote I always like to kind of use because Albert Einstein had a learning disability, and he's Albert Einstein. And everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking it's stupid. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about um, kids, that how they perceive themselves based upon the way that their parents manage or handle the information about that child's ADHD. It's also not just about how you have that conversation with your son or daughter. It's about how they interact with their siblings. Because you will see in the family dynamic, the kid with ADHD, and I say this as a joke, but it's really not a joke, is that it's not just about inability in regulating attention. In some cases, it's an insatiable craving for attention. And you will see that the child with the disability often gets the most attention, good or bad, from the parents because there's just a lot going on. And the child who, I hate to use the word normal, the neurotypical child, okay, that does their homework or doesn't need special services, often kind of feels like the invisible child. And you have to manage that diagnosis. And I would also encourage you, especially if it's an older sibling that's neurotypical, get them to help you make the disabled child feel better about who they are. One of the interventions, I used to run an organization, a nonprofit that used to provide executive functioning coaching for, it was a very specialized type of coaching for students with ADHD and executive functioning that would go off to college. And it was so helpful because it was something they could do on their own. And the model for this type of coaching was, it was a talent-based model. So it wasn't negative feedback. They would help these kids understand that there were certain things they did extremely well and try to help them build on those, but also respect and acknowledge there were things that they could not do well and kind of learn how to dance around those. And there's a lot of that goes on at college. Just think about it for a second. And this could be a whole other presentation. They dislike you as their parent because you're providing what they need, which is structure. High school and middle school are probably the closest things outside of the criminal justice system to a jail that you will ever face in your life, okay? They're constantly getting their heads counted. The bell rings, they go here, they go there. They're constantly evaluated. There is a, demerit system or reward system. They get their time in the yard every day. When they go off to college, that's out the window. It's a completely unstructured environment. Okay, all the things they hated about being in the home and being in high school really were things that provided them a significant amount of structure that is required for them. Coaching is a means to help them feel better about themselves, and it's something that they can do on their own. The goals they set with their coach are their goals, not their parents, not their teachers' goals. And it is very, very helpful for kids, especially in the sense of self-esteem. If I could sum it up in one word, I would say empowerment. I also think, for organizations like SPED NET and Smart Kids or CHAD or any of these advocacy organizations, they provide you with information, but they also provide you with a sense of community. Okay, I firmly believe there is an enormous amount of comfort in knowing that you're not alone during this process, even if you don't have the answers. There are other parents looking for them just like you, and kids need that same environment. And so that is something, sometimes they have to embrace their disability, their autism, their ADHD, their learning disability, while it is a cognitive impairment to a certain degree. Just think about a blind person for a second. Someone who's sight impaired, that's obviously a very, very significant disability. But you will find that people who are legally blind or have a sight impairment develop an unbelievable, almost superhuman sense of hearing or touch or smell, because their brain has to compensate. Your children with disabilities can do things that you can't just because of who they are. And you have to recognize that. And you have to make sure they give themselves credit when it's due. And, you know, my doctor, when he diagnosed me, says, look, let me explain ADHD to you this way. I would never let somebody with ADHD balance my checkbook, but it's the only person I'd want to be standing next to in a burning building. There are some things we can do really well, and there are some things that functionally we can't. And you could say that probably about anybody. So there really is nothing to be ashamed of. Have that conversation. And if you believe that there are people at the school or people in your community that don't have that buy-in to understand this kid's disability, take the time and educate them, just like you do at the IEP meeting, at the 504 meeting, just like the conversation you're trying to understand your child so you can explain it to the school. It's the same thing in the community. Why is that kid acting up? There was someone in my office who has a son on the autism spectrum with severe needs. And his older brother, when he was maybe 10, made these buttons that said, I'm not misbehaving, I have autism. And he felt he needed to do that for his brother. And it's funny when I talk to people and they say, you know, you're very open about your ADHD. And my colleague Michael about his autism, or this other woman, Patara, about her dyslexia, it's the only way we're letting you know I turned out okay. Sure, there are things I'm challenged with, and you know, there are times my wife wants to throw me through a closed window, but I was able to get through school. I was able to recognize things that I was able to do okay, and there are things that I still am very afraid of. So that is important. Did you have a question, ma'am? Eve, do you want to?
Oh, there you are. Hi, I have a child who just finished her sophomore year at Syracuse, and she was diagnosed with ADHD when she was 8. And I'm an occupational therapist, and I worked in schools with kids with disabilities, and she never listened to a word I said about anything, but I made sure she had all the resources at school, but she wouldn't really take her meds regularly. She didn't like to talk about having ADHD. She's a performer. She's an acting major at Syracuse. I thought for sure she was going to flunk out first semester. She's got such executive function impairment that I spent most of my entire life with her as a parent, picking up after everything that she did or didn't do or forgot or didn't, just didn't do. And she's thriving. She has the extra time. She doesn't really use it. She takes her meds when she feels like it, but she's mentoring kids with disabilities in classes, which is so ironic. It's just so weird. And Syracuse has done really nothing for her. They said, sure, send us the information. She'll have the accommodations, but she's going to have to advocate for herself. If she doesn't talk to her teachers, like you were saying, they're not going to do it just because it's written down somewhere. They're probably not going to even look at it. And because she's an acting major and she's in a performing arts school, most of those kids have some form of ADHD or a learning disability. She's surrounded by them, and they just do okay, and she's doing fine.
I was asked a question one night, and it's funny, I speak at these meetings, and there were 2 nights in a row. One of them was my home school, and the other one was a school in Mamaroneck. And when I got there, they were going to film it, and they were all very, very upset at the parents. There was about 60 parents there, and nobody had mentioned that they were going to film it ahead of time. And parents were concerned that the camera might pick up the backs of their heads. And so anybody watching it on television would maybe recognize the back of their head. And if you're at a special ed meeting, that means your kid has special ed. So they were flipping out about it. And I got there, and so the cameraman, he kind of close up on me the entire time. And it was like, remember this old story about Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show? They just kind of from the waist up because they were afraid of his lewd movements. So, and I drove the guy crazy because I usually walk around a lot. And those parents also did not want their voice asking a question on the film. And so they wrote out the questions on cards and they were sent up to me. And one of them was a very similar to the last comment, and about, how do I get my daughter to stop drawing and focus more on her, all she wants to do is draw. And I want her to focus more on her schoolwork. And my first impression was, be grateful, feel thankful your child is passionate about something, whether it's music or poetry or anything. Think about it for a second. 1,000 years from now, when the archaeologists are digging us up, okay, they're not going to care who was the best investment banker or who, made the dean's list. They're going to evaluate our civilization based on our pottery and our literature and all of our artistic endeavors. Just let that, now, a kid in 3rd grade still has to do math. I get it. Okay. But, there's a way to embrace those talents in a way. And, I say to kids when I speak at schools, to young children, I say, listen, I take my medication because it helps me put up with the rest of the world that's non-ADHD. Sometimes I need to do that, and, but there are times when I'm on trial, for instance, I don't take my medication. I need me to shine through. Learning to temper that, though, sometimes takes a bit. And, especially kids who are artistic or are performers, a lot of times the inhibitions are down. There's a famous doctor who wrote that book, Driven to Distraction, Ned Hallowell, who says that the creativity that people talk about with ADHD is really impulsivity that's gone right. Okay. Because most people kind of put a wall up and filter things. We have a lot less filters. I keep telling my son that when I am in my 80s, he's in trouble because I'm going to have zero filtering. Let's see. Okay. I'm nearing the end, and then I wanted to read something for you. Crucial support for ADHD and learning disabilities, kids on the spectrum. Behavioral plans are key for kids on the spectrum, for sure. Services, whether it be counseling services, social skills, reading support. If they are dyslexic, you need to identify, because not all dyslexia manifests itself the same way. You need to understand your child's particular manifestation of it. The best way is to have that conversation with them. Support, sometimes it's accommodations that are helpful. Sometimes it's a placement in a school outside of the district, okay? And you need to make sure that you are open, because you don't want to preclude yourself from any remedies that the law might allow. If you refuse an evaluation, for instance, because you don't want to label your child, that is something that could be held against you at a certain point in time if there's a discipline issue, especially when it comes down to manifestation. You wouldn't be entitled to it, and that's really key. Special education is a service, not a place. Least restrictive environment. Say that to yourselves over and over. Least restrictive environment. I'm not sending him somewhere. Push in versus pull out. School discipline. I'm going to go through these really quick because I know we're going over on time. I apologize. Manifestation is the key. Understanding that disability. And if a manifestation exists, they can't suspend a child for more than 10 days. Okay. If there are 3 exceptions, a weapon, serious physical injury, or drugs, it can be 45 school days. But these days, with all of the things you're reading about, I'm seeing suspensions for a semester, for a year. And there in Connecticut, there's an expulsion statute. So transition to college, we talked about this. No more child fine. K-12, it's the school district's responsibility to identify these children within their jurisdiction and provide services and support for them. Once they move on to post-secondary, it's the responsibility of the child, and FERPA gets in your way now. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act guarantees that when your kid is in K-12, you have exclusive, secret, I hate to say that, access to their full educational file. When your kids go off to college, you no longer have that right. They're considered adults. It's their right. So you need to plan ahead for that. Have that conversation with them. Are you still going to be involved as their parent, advocating and helping them with the disability office? Are they going to take the mantle on their own? These are things you have to have a discussion with. And like I said, that secrecy issue, a lot of kids will kind of take that with them to post-secondary and not avail themselves of services that could help them. How do we tackle stigma? What's the most powerful force in the universe? I have learned it is a mom on a mission. That is how we do this. Educate yourself, educate everyone. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. On the last slide, just from a practical standpoint, like going off to college, when, to your point about like if the professors aren't reading whatever, even if they self-advocate to the office, the local, that if that doesn't get dispersed to all their individual teachers, what from a practical standpoint, should they like the first week, like obviously a college professor, I would imagine the first day is not a great day to approach them, but what's like in your experience the best advice to a child to when they're on their own, how to approach their teachers?
It's an excellent point. That how do you translate from the disability office to the classroom?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very complex issue because I find that a lot of parents in high school are fighting to get services. In college, there's a disability office that gets funded. They have resources and they are begging students to come in. We have note takers. We have help with essay writing. Nobody wants to show up and avail themselves of it. But even if your child gets accommodations in college, that doesn't mean they're going to get them. Having that piece of paper, their student plan or student contract, it's called different things. It's under 504, but it's not called a 504 plan anymore. And there's a huge disconnect sometimes between the disability office and a tenured professor who says, I don't give extra time. I've been teaching this course for 30 years. I'm tenured. I just don't do this. How do you develop that? A lot of it involves a paper trail with the disability office. If there are issues with grades, you can address that there. Sometimes other interventions like coaching can help. There are a number of ways, but it's a tricky issue. I don't have a magic answer for you, but I would say to alert and have your child alert the disability office that there are teachers who are not allowing them to exercise their accommodations that they've been given by the school. And that may be a fight, and it may have to mean that they get switched to a different classroom or take that course from somebody else at a later date and be allowed to withdraw. You certainly don't want to keep them and force an issue if it's going to make things worse. But by the same token, they actually stepped up and got the accommodations they need. I think that creating and building a paper trail is key. And the good news is parents have a lot of phone conversations with people at the school. Oh, so-and-so told me they were going to do this. When was that? 2 years ago. Did you follow it up with an email? No, they told me it wouldn't be a problem. I guarantee you 2-3 years later, college students put everything in emails and texts and build that paper trail. It's crucial. It's helpful. So I would definitely follow up with I would let it go a little bit, but after the first couple of weeks of the semester, if they're not getting what they need, they should alert somebody.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question about the elementary crew. What's the best way to talk to siblings and the child who has the ADHD? Like start the conversation, or is there a good resource? I have boy-girl twins, and there's a lot of sibling stuff happening because my boy has ADHD, and then there's a younger sister who's meticulous with everything like her other sister. So
that's a good question. There are a number of, I talked about coaching in the context of coaching someone with ADHD or an executive functioning issue, but there are coaches. The coaching model is usually maybe 14 and up. There are a number of organizations that are excellent at providing coaching to parents of younger children. How to approach different situations, how to have these conversations, and just like if you were sitting in front of your children, I'm sure every parent, okay, which one of your children is your favorite? I love them all. I love them differently. They're different people. You know, having ADHD is really no different than one child has green eyes or blue eyes, or if one of your child was a diabetic and the other one wasn't. You would have to make certain concessions. You would have to make sure that your other children understood why you had to go to the doctor maybe more with that other child, but you could do it in a way that would make them be more empathetic to their sibling. The difference is twofold. One is you can't always see it, and that is harder for people, especially kids, to buy into. You're saying he's different, but he's just like me. He's bad more. And how come he doesn't get in trouble? And if I do something, I get in trouble. So I think you have to, kind of develop it as an invisible disability and understand it's the way that he processes things, and he doesn't always do it on purpose. And we have to kind of understand what might make him act out this way. But there are things that he can do that he can help you with. And I think that you really have to kind of let them know that while the disability is important to understand, it doesn't completely define who their brother or sister is. But there are, like I said, a couple of parent coaching communities that if you want to follow up with me and email me, I can give you some resources, or I could send them to Eve for parents, because they can be really helpful. And getting a child, the only downside of coaching is that it won't work unless the student steps up and actively participates. So if you say something like, we'll let you try college on your own. If you don't have the grades after the first semester, you get in a coach. Now the coach is the punishment. So, if they're going to accept this and work with it, that's important. There was a slide I had, tackling stigma, educating yourself, talk openly with your children, teach them to advocate, actively involve them in the process, educate their teachers, friends, the community, discuss multimodal approaches. Exercise is huge. Medication, exercise. There's a book written by one of the guys who wrote Driven to Distraction, John Rady. It's called Spark, all of the research behind exercise and brain function. Excellent book. And it's written, his first book I couldn't understand. It was way above my head. But Spark was excellent. And if you're not going to medicate, because it is a personal decision, you should certainly incorporate all of these others as a multimodal approach. Okay, do's and don'ts. Talk to your kids about their disability, educate everyone. And that means them, their school, their family, the rest of your family, the community. Focus on their strengths. Don't be afraid to discuss medication. Teach and encourage them to advocate for themselves. Don't keep their disability a secret. Don't tell them they're taking vitamins. Get caught up in their challenges. Focus on what they can do and maybe their challenges, a way to navigate around them. Don't just assume that they're making a conscious decision they want to disobey you, because that's not what's happening. Don't make patronizing comments, okay? And let's see, I think the example I use is, okay, here's my example. Look, mommy lost her keys. Maybe I have ADHD sometimes, just like you, okay? Now, you might think you're bonding with your child and you're recognizing the symptoms of executive functioning. But what that child is hearing is, I just did something incredibly stupid and I'm angry with myself. So I'm like you today. That's what they're hearing, because all of the forgetfulness and all of that stuff are all negative things for them, okay? And it also kind of dilutes the challenges that they face in an unfair way. Translation, I just did something incredibly stupid, okay. And all the time is a key, because it's, like I said before, the chronic nature and the level of impairment. This is what they face on a daily basis. Okay, conclusions. Understand your child's disability. Talk to your children about their disability. Educate yourself, the school, and your community, other members of your family. Think about what you say and how you say it. ADHD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, LD, are not related to intelligence or sanity, okay? These are processing, performance issues that you can really step up and help them with in a constructive way. All right. Different isn't better or worse, it's just different. Encourage unconventional thinking. That's something I didn't touch on quickly. You hear in business settings all the time, you have to learn to think outside the box. We live outside the box, okay? We're unconventional. Sometimes there's something to be said for that. It's important, it's helpful. Okay, anyone can be cool, but awesome takes practice. Embrace who they are and their individuality, okay? It is really very important to them. There's one more thing, and I'll take some more questions before I go, and that is, I wrote this many years ago. It's a poem that I wrote for, I just didn't think my wife understood me, especially the diagnosis. And I was out running one day and I wrote this poem. It's called The Wonderfulness of Me. If you took all of the things that were special about me, you can put them all together and call it ADHD. No better, no worse, just different, that's me. I'm really not crazy, please try and see. Like a talented wizard in a world full of muggles, it's no wonder all you see is frustration and struggles. As I daydream and drift, you think no one's there, but nothing could be further from the truth. Believe me, I swear. I see your impatience as my mind starts to wander, but you don't know the depth of the thoughts that I ponder. For creative thinkers get lost in deep thought, which leads to the illusion that they cannot be taught. I know trying to reach me can give you the blues, but I wish for just once you could walk in my shoes. To see things through my eyes, you would be amazed at the speed and sheer volume my thoughts seem to blaze. I'm not lazy or stupid if only you knew how truly difficult it is to limit myself and think like you do. But I can see things that you'll never see. It's like second nature because I am me. With lightning fast reflexes, I can switch gears. To be firm and inflexible is the worst of my fears. I'm calm in a crisis and know just what to do. For I'm in great company, Mozart, Edison, and Churchill, to name just a few. So show me some patience as I'm patient with you. Just a little tolerance, it's long overdue. Please try and understand me along with my ADHD. It's a very big part of the wonderfulness of me. And that's all I have.